And currently I work with the HIV/HCV Resource Center in Lebanon, New Hampshire. Primarily, I operate the Claremont Exchange Services Program, also known as the Needle Exchange Program, that serves Sullivan County and Grafton County, New Hampshire. And this is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart because I entered recovery in 2014 and everything was opioid, opioid, opioid. And I definitely shot plenty of heroin, but looking back, stimulants were kind of my primary bottom. Stimulants, particularly injecting cocaine, was really, the most troublesome and problematic drug use for me, and caused the most problems. And I had this experience where I was using IV cocaine without my permission, but I entered into recovery and everything was opioids and MAT, and I've kind of seen a really great innovation in our understanding of substance use disorders and particularly opioid use disorders. But as we've seen rises in stimulant use, I've seen a lot of misinformation, disinformation, people who use stimulants being very underserved, and a lot of unnecessary suffering for this population. And so this is going to be a non-clinical training. I'm going to have you for about 90 minutes, and we're going to be pretty consistently coming back to my lived experience as a former injection drug user, maybe the experience of some people that I know and love, and definitely want to open this up for some participation and some feedback along the way. And I'm unable to see the chat altogether right now, just so our fellow moderator co-host people know. So basically, we're gonna start out this conversation today talking about harm reduction, and maybe a view of harm reduction that's a little bit different than previous trainings. And then we're gonna slide right into understanding drugs, drug use, and use disorders, and kind of understanding there is a difference between people who use drugs and people with a use disorder. And that's going to kind of lead us into recovery-oriented systems, or like systems that are conducive to recovery and improved health and wellness and people reaching their full potential. And we will talk about opioids a little bit, primarily because we know quite a bit about opioids. So that's a good baseline to really talk about drugs. We'll get a little bit into, the role of dopamine and the role of addiction and opioids. And that'll really give us a good framework to dive into talking about methamphetamine, cocaine, and bath salts or stimulants. And we'll get into some data along the way too to show that stimulant use is on the rise, not only here in New Hampshire, but throughout the country and throughout the world. And really emphasizing some ways to address these issues with humanity, and how to prevent death and disease and suffering. And so that'll really land us on stimulant overdose and harm reduction strategies for people who use stimulants. And then we'll round it out with supporting people who use stimulants. And that'll be, maybe most relevant to this group. I think a lot of you are working in different recovery centers or in kind of the peer support role. So, yeah, that being said, we're going to kind of get into this a little bit. So what is harm reduction? I would really encourage you to think right now about how you define harm reduction. I know people that, practice harm reduction, but maybe they're not harm reductionists. I know people that do the same exact work that I do, operating syringe services programs and meeting people where they're at, that may have a different definition of harm reduction. And that may look clinical, like the supervised injection site you see. That may look a little more like a card table in public, where you see Jesse Harvey on the left and Dave Purchase to the right of him. And harm reduction is kind of synonymous to naloxone or the name brand Narcan or opioid overdose. But really, I think when we talk about harm reduction in America, of course, we need access to naloxone. And really the overarching goal of harm reduction is to reduce drug-related death and disease, and really emphasizing that with harm reduction, all drug-related death and disease is preventable. So we give people who use opioids naloxone, or people who are going to witness an overdose naloxone. We really, harm reduction really tries to engender a sense of autonomy and agency in people. And so when people ask for help, they're met with dignity and respect and given evidence-based treatment options. And my experience going to rehab 4 different times, it was basically go to wherever you can get into. The first one that accepts you, go there. Doesn't really matter what it is, just go away was kind of what I was told. Go away for a while and sort out your condition, go to rehab. And that saved my life. I went 4 different times, and I'm incredibly grateful for, you know, rehab and outpatient counseling and the 12 steps and people that really came into my life and helped me in my recovery journey. But I realize now in kind of sustained recovery that I had quite a bit of social privilege. So my experience of, you know, kind of a person with privilege isn't the same as everybody else. And so people have different needs. And a big part of my recovery capital was, you know, parents that could house me when I entered recovery. But we really need to look at housing first, or harm reduction housing, and giving people housing without contingencies. And you know, my thoughts and prayers go out to the people in the encampments in Manchester today who are being cleared out of their homes. Their tent city in Manchester is being disassembled, they're being kicked out. And when we look at a syndemic that we're facing, multiple epidemics on top of each other, COVID-19, HIV, Hep C, use disorders, overdose, mental health, homelessness, we really need to look at housing as a human right. And of course, harm reduction with a capital H and a capital R focuses on drug policy and criminal justice reform, because, you know, it's sometimes damaging if you're only going to practice harm reduction, you know, clinically or medically, or in a medicalized model, without addressing the human rights issues that come with living under the world of prohibition and the war on drugs. And this really isn't going to get too much into the social movement today. We're going to talk about a lot of different things. Some of my other trainings definitely get into that stuff more, but I think primarily when folks think about harm reduction, they see, you know, syringe services programs or needle exchange programs, or in other countries, we see clinical supervised consumption sites, or, you know, supervised injection sites. And so when I'm talking about supervised use in the United States, though, it's really about people not using drugs alone. It's about people being accountable to one another and having that peer-to-peer support for drug users, because anytime I lost someone to a fatal overdose, they were alone and behind a closed door because of stigma. So we tell people to supervise one another, take care of one another, and we give folks fentanyl test strips, and so that they can have on-site drug checking programs to see if there's fentanyl or other adulterants in their drug supply. And that's a big part of stimulant overdose and stimulant death, is stimulants that are being tainted with fentanyl and other unwanted adulterants. And at the end of this, we'll talk a little bit about safe supply, or, you know, prescription replacement therapies. We know about Vivitrol and methadone and buprenorphine or Suboxone, but we don't really talk about FDA-approved treatments for stimulant use disorders, because there's no approved medication for stimulant use disorders. But there are things that we could be talking about. But again, this is going to be a non-clinical training, and we're really going to look at you know, how to support people that we know and love, whether they're our clients, our peers, our friends, our family. Really, we look at harm reduction as kind of this taboo or radical thing, but harm reduction is all around us, and we use it every day. It's really just a set of evidence-supported strategies and ideas aimed at reducing the consequences associated with risky behaviors, or really any human behavior, because anything human has a risk associated to it, and anything human can both help and harm. But what's really important to remember is that any human behavior serves a purpose. People don't do things for no reason. You know, I don't really want my friends to jump out of a plane, but they're looking for that adrenaline and that dopamine rush and that life-changing experience. So if they want to jump out of a plane, I want them to wear a parachute. You can kind of think of many ideas of harm reduction being all around you. And today we're going to look at some new material coming out of the National Harm Reduction Coalition that looks at principles that are central to harm reduction practice. And so I'm wondering if there are any a volunteer that would like to read these 4 bullet points for the group, just to break up the sound of my voice.
Sure, I will, Ryan. This is Polly. National
Polly.
Harm Reduction Coalition considers the following principles central to harm reduction practice. Accepts, for better or for worse, that illicit and illicit drug use is part of our world and choose to work to minimize its harmful effects rather than simply ignore or condemn them. Understands drug use as a complex, multifaceted phenomena that encompasses a continuum of behaviors from severe abuse to total abstinence, and acknowledges that some ways of using drugs are clearly safer than others. Establishing quality of individual and community life and well-being, not necessarily cessation of all drug use, as the criteria for successful interventions and policies. Calls for the non-judgmental, non-coercive provision of services and resources to people who use drugs and the communities in which they live in order to assist them in reducing attendant harm.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
So really what I like to emphasize with this stuff is that, there's really no recorded human history without drug use. People as far back as recorded history goes have used drugs of some kind. And for most of human history, it was celebrated or ceremonial, but we have this westernized idea about drug use as being characterized by isolation or self-medicating or being alone. But really, again, it's a topic where I say let's look to indigenous cultures to look at how do they deal with these issues. And really, harm reduction acknowledges that drug use is something that has happened and will always happen, and there's a way to support people and provide non-judgmental, non-coercive services. But we have a long way to go before we get to this place here. But when we look at these principles, it's really conducive to recovery-oriented systems and the work of William White and kind of what we're trying to create here in New Hampshire. So it's 8 principles. Those are the first 4. Would somebody care to volunteer to read off these next 4 principles for the group, please?
My name's Erica. I guess I'll read it. Ensures that drug users and those with a history of drug use routinely have real voice in the creation of programs and policies designed to serve them. Affirms drug users themselves as the primary agents of reducing the harms of their drug use, and seeks to empower users to share information and support each other in strategies which meet their actual conditions of use. Recognizes that the realities of poverty, class, racism, social isolation, past trauma, sex-based discrimination, and other social inequalities affect both people's vulnerability to and capacity for effectively dealing with drug-related harm. Does not attempt to minimize or ignore the real and tragic harm and danger associated with licit and illicit drug use.
Thank you, Erica. So really, what I like to, you could go a lot of different directions in this stuff, but really it's, a pragmatic approach of meeting people where they're at and providing services that meet their needs in the moment. As far as use disorders go, we kind of tell people to, hit a bottom, hit diagnostic criteria, and then come here and we'll sort out your symptoms and we'll hope for the best. But that doesn't meet the needs of people. And what I've seen working throughout New Hampshire in addiction treatment and recovery is that the most vulnerable people do not have their needs met. And systems work great for people with privilege, but what I would see time and time again is people who really need services whose needs are not met. And really, we tell people oftentimes that, the problem is your problem. It's an internal thing. You need to fix it. and we give people these modalities, and like, that's great, but we really fail to acknowledge discrimination and oppression that comes from this. And we talk a lot about stigma in the recovery community. Stigma is just a nice way to talk about discrimination and oppression. And if we look at drug use as a whole throughout our society, we really see that substance use disorders, diagnostic criteria, continuing to use despite negative consequences and everything that comes with that, really seems to be a measure of how somebody is impacted by the war on drugs, or how they're impacted by systemic inequities or structural violence. And structural violence is kind of a nebulous term, but really, when we think about systems, we're living under the world of prohibition and the war on drugs. And really, there's a lot to that. And so harm reduction not only looks at the needs of the individual and the community around them, but the world in which we live, and finds ways to minimize harms, reduce death and disease, and also doesn't minimize the tragedy that comes with this. And so as we kind of start broad and get more and more specific into the work that we all do working with people here in New Hampshire, we can use harm reduction as a framework for working with people who use drugs or who once used drugs. And when we talk about drug use, I think of them as in terms of relationships. Like, we all have a relationship to drugs, and avoidance is a relationship. If you're abstinent, that's fine. Abstinence is a form of harm reduction. Harm reduction might mean that you no longer use drugs. That's great. Harm reduction is a continuum of strategies, and it helps us to better understand the people we work with, and we strive for any positive change, any step in the right direction. And it's client-centered, it's person-driven, there's no coercion or ultimatums or contingencies. If we continue, or if we define substance use disorders as continuing to use despite negative consequences, why is it only negative reinforcement and negative consequences that we offer people? A lot of what we, a lot of the way that we treat use disorders are contrary to what we understand about the condition. And so it looks to support people with positive reinforcement, and it's not about punishing people. And, our society has a really interesting obsession with punishment, control, compliance, and these types of things that are kind of pervasive in our society. But we know that prohibition does work. To change their behavioral condition doesn't work, but here we are in the overdose crisis. And so really the way to get through that is a couple of different things we're going to touch on today, but really it's about understanding drugs and drug use using a lens of science and not morality or ideology or fixed ideas. And harm reduction really emphasizes the latest research and evidence. And really the moral issue is hard for me right now with stimulants, because I'm seeing some really awful behavior in people in my life who are using stimulants whose needs are not being met, and they're behaving in various ways. And it's really easy for me to go the moral route, or the isolation route, or the separation route. But I've seen the role of isolation in killing people with this disorder. And so really trying to stay based on evidence and science and not morality or ideology. But that's hard because this is emotionally charged stuff, and it's difficult to really work with folks. So really harm reduction also emphasizes that some drug use is safer than others, and looks at the context in which the drugs are used. So really I'd like to emphasize the work of Dr. Norman Zinberg, who wrote a book and released a body of research called more or less Drug Set and Setting. So oftentimes when we talk about a drug problem, we talk about just the drug. What is it? Is it an upper? Is it a downer? Is it how potent is it? How pure is it? What is it cut with? How is it used? Is it smoked, snorted, injected? Is it legal or illegal? And for folks on the call who don't have the lived experience I do as a former injection drug user, sometimes alcohol is a good framework to understand harm reduction, because we saw in the 20s and 30s that prohibition didn't work, and we saw what happened there. And sometimes it's for people who use drugs, it would kind of be like if you went to the store and bought a 6-pack of beer, but one of those beers was 100 proof and it tasted just the same, and you didn't realize that one of your beers was going to give you alcohol poisoning. It's kind of this really marginalized, dangerous world that drug users live in. But primarily society, when we try to address this, focuses just on the drug, prohibiting it, etc., risk, supply reduction, demand reduction. But we fail oftentimes to look at the set, and that's what somebody brings to the table. So that could be a person's physiology, their mental health, their emotional state. It could be their cultural identity or their sense of belonging. And that's a big part of this, because remember, any human behavior serves a purpose, including using drugs. And so for me, drugs did for me what society wasn't doing for me. I was more or less being neglected at home as an adolescent. I found a social circle where, I didn't know how to say, I'm feeling anxious or I'm feeling these issues. I just knew that I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to feel like this. And I was suicidal and anxious. And when I found drugs, they were a relief to me. They kind of did for me what I wasn't getting at home or from society. And sense of belonging was a really big part of my continued use and sale of drugs. Selling drugs was a big part of my 10 years of chaotic drug use, because they gave me a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of financial security. And a lot of my recovery process was looking at not what was wrong with my behavior, but what was right with my behavior. And so understanding, if I was using painkillers, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, fentanyl, it's not so much why the painkiller, but why the pain. And that gets into a really important question of, what are the expectations of a drug and the motivation for using the drug? So you could have two recoverees you're working with who are from the same community, same neighborhood, using the same drugs. And you could ask them, what are the benefits of your drug use? And one might say, I use to treat lower back pain. And the other one might say, well, I use to make the voices in my head stop. That's kind of two different recovery processes for two people using the same drug. And so it's important to look at not only the drug, but the individual using the drug, and also the setting or the community around them, the world around them. And that includes stressors in someone's life. The socioeconomic impact is very clear with COVID-19 and physical distancing in the world that we're living in an economic recession. We can see some pretty scary numbers coming in about overdose rates, relapse, domestic violence. And it really comes back to, an idea that I share with some kind of harm reductionists that came before me, that it's a little more than a disease. It's an environmental condition that is really aggravated and sometimes manifested by a person's setting. So do they have support, or do they lack support? With who and where a person uses it, a big part of reducing harm, and also the cultural attitudes towards the drug and its users. And right now there's a whole bunch of stigma against people who use stimulants within treatment, within recovery, within society at large. And there's a lot of reason for that too, but really we're just seeing people whose needs aren't being met, and they're doing the best they can with what they have. And unfortunately for a lot of people in America, drug use is one of the best coping skills they have right now. And we oftentimes tell them, like, do away with your coping skill or your defense mechanism, do away with this thing that's serving a purpose in your life. And it's really damaging to people and it kills people. And so really harm reduction looks at the humanity of each person and the fact that they're not using drugs for no reason. There's a reason that they're doing this. And if we look at the reason, we can maybe find meaningful replacements. And so another kind of misnomer that we see in, society's understanding of drugs and drug use is, especially in the addiction treatment world, we want to believe that drug use is either abstinent or chaotic or dangerous or use disorders, but everybody is born abstinent of drug-taking behavior. There are, of course, infants born with neonatal abstinence syndrome, growing rates, of course, but most human beings will experiment with drugs. I'm a long time into experimenting with caffeine. I'm drinking caffeine right now. Some of you are also on caffeine. You may also be on nicotine or other things. I know maybe some of you have experimented with illicit drugs too. But the truth is that very few people ever go beyond occasional or social use where they ever need to have that conversation with that dirty M word there, moderation. we don't hear a lot about moderation. And in 4 attempts at rehab, I never once heard that M word. It was, you're to be abstinent, and if you use once, you're going to relapse, full-blown, chaotic, heavy, dangerous. And it really speaks to the concept of pharmacological determinism. And that's a big fancy word that basically means, like, if you think something's going to happen when you take a drug, it's more likely to happen. And so if I have a use disorder that's characterized by continuing to use despite negative consequences, or continuing to use without my consent or my own permission, and I have a drink or I use once, I'm told time and time again that I'm going to relapse and this is going to get out of control. But that's just simply not true for everyone. It is true for some, and I'm not saying it's not true for some, but really when we look at long-term studies of use disorders, we're seeing that moderation may be the most common outcome of people with use disorders. But we have a multi-billion-dollar treatment industry that's really built on these fallacies that, we need to mandate abstinence, and if people relapse, then they're bound to come back. And I'm seeing the Florida shuffle come to New Hampshire in a really funny way. And so when we do talk about use disorders or heavy chaotic use, we'll say that right now it's pretty. The latest numbers I've seen is that 16% of housed Americans meet criteria for a use disorder. So 16% of housed American adults, like, that's up for sure, and that's a growing rate. And it really goes to show that, like, what we're doing is not working. And it actually, if we look at prohibition and the war on drugs, it really has done nothing but proliferate drug use, drug addiction, the black market, and raise overdose rates. All the things that prohibition and the war on drugs were supposed to stop have only gotten far worse. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that, the overdose crisis is really a manifestation of the war on drugs. But if we want to talk about use disorders or our service population, we want to talk about it as a chronic health issue or a disease or a disorder. With any other chronic health issue, we take incremental change steps. So any steps in the right direction, reducing risk, reducing symptoms, really anything towards improvement, we're going to celebrate, whether that's asthma, diabetes, heart conditions, etc. But we really don't treat use disorders like that at all. We really kind of define goals for people and say your goal is to be abstinent and manage your symptoms. And if you get too symptomatic, you have to leave our program. Or if you exhibit symptoms of your disorder, we can't help you. But if you sort out those symptoms and come back to us, we'll definitely bill your insurance. And so we really see this as damaging and re-traumatizes a lot of people. And we kind of give people the message who are maybe occasional social or experimental drug users that you don't meet criteria, like you're not a fit here. Maybe go out and hit a new bottom, or, you don't inject stimulants, so we can't admit you to our program. And we tell people that, it's almost like this underlying theme I would see at the doorways and with the RAPS line is that people are told to go get worse. And so we see this as kind of a lot of steps backwards and really not addressing it like a health issue, because we're not going to treat this like a health issue as long as we treat it like a crime. You can't have it both ways. You can't call this a disease and treat it in the jails and prisons. And what we've seen is, the criminalization of people who use drugs has gotten us where we are today. And so we're working with somebody who's not motivated by abstinence, or maybe they don't know. Maybe they've never been asked the question, is it your goal to be abstinent? Because as soon as we're defining people's goals for them, we're taking away from them their agency and their autonomy, and it's not a movement of empowerment. And what really works with recovery is individuals being empowered to improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and reach their full potential. And so we got to find, what motivates people to change. And again, back to that question earlier, what are the benefits of your drug use? Have you ever considered personal limits? And, with moderation management philosophies, I always like to emphasize, rather than just saying, be safe or be well, and I do say those things, we got to ask people open-ended questions. How are you staying safe? How are you protecting yourself? What can we do today to help you? If you don't want to address being abstinent today, how can we help you? And it's really looking towards a more holistic, whole health approach that really makes a lot of sense and comes back to those principles of harm reduction that, you know, providing services that meet the needs of people based on their conditions. You know, we need to meet people where they're at, but not leave them there. We need to meet them where they're at and empower them and educate them to make better decisions and better choices. And so we got to really look at expanding our any pathway, or honoring all pathways of recovery, to include pathways of recovery that don't include abstinence. And I do consider taking medication-assisted recovery as prescribed to be abstinent, and that's just that. But really, I kind of beat this up already, that we really have an acute care model for substance use disorders. And we tell people, meet criteria, come to treatment, and then hopefully you come out and you love your life, you have a job, you have, you know, sense of belonging, faith, housing. But that's about 10% of the time, you know, and that, you know, people throw that number around a lot, but really, we're really, you know, seeing this is ineffective, when really the evidence would support a recovery-oriented system where the needs of an individual are met without contingencies or ultimatums. And, you know, we ask people, you know, what is it you want to work on? And harm reduction really emphasizes, just beyond addiction treatment or treatment for drug use, it's about healthcare and services for people who use drugs. So housing, food assistance, healthcare, sense of belonging, a faith community, or sense of spirituality. And the truth is that you could use this as exercise for your recoveries, and they could kind of fill in the circles. And early recovery or inactive use, a few of those circles are probably drugs and alcohol, you know, using, buying, selling drugs. And so we tell people, take that out of your equation, take that out of your whole health approach, and good luck, call us if you need anything. But really, my experience in recovery was filling in those gaps. And so, you know, I no longer grow cannabis or mushrooms, but I found gardening, and I found that gardening was a huge gap filler that first year of recovery. Obviously, meetings, sense of, you know, connection. I found church. I found these great things that filled in the world around me. And when I entered into working in addiction treatment, I had the ability to flush drugs down the toilet that I was a slave to not too long ago. But really, this approach works, and it's really about having the individual fill in the world around them and not filling it in for them. Sorry, just checking the chat. So recovery-oriented systems, the work of William White, really important to get into for sure. Because we're seeing a crazy spike deaths, and you know, this stuff right here, the traditional treatment approach, prohibition, the war on drugs, everything I just criticized, clearly isn't working. We're far away from this, but this is where we are right now. So from April 19 to April 2020, it's predicted that we lost 77,000 Americans to preventable overdose death. We're right now in a period of time where we're seeing a 13.2% increase nationally in fatal overdoses. We're going to lose at least 75,000 people this year, probably more. That's, you know, a couple football stadiums of preventable deaths. And we really can't even think about what that is. Like, what does 75,000 dead people look like? What does that mean to us? But some of those numbers are my friends and people that I love a lot. And this is preventable with harm reduction. And this is preventable with a fact-based drug education. And really just looking at the bigger picture here, that this shit's gonna stop. Like, when is enough death enough? Like, when is death enough? You know, it's just really frustrating. And so some of these kind of become my vent sessions, because I'm just constantly grieving people who are dying of overdose. And that's largely around opioids for sure, but I'm also grieving the long-term damage of other drugs like stimulants on people I know and love. And I'm seeing some really horrific physical and mental conditions coming out of the long-term use of stimulants, and people whose needs are not being met. And when we look at these numbers, 77,749 predicted overdose deaths in a 12-month period, those are people whose needs were not met. Those are people who had a big heart and were self-medicating for some reason or another, and their needs were not met, and now they're dead and they're not coming back. So this is a movement of meeting the needs of people based on their conditions with a logical idea around it, because like, it's just, I can't, yeah, I'm just rambling at this point. And, but this is about New Hampshire, and, you know, New Hampshire is ground zero for the opioid epidemic, or a drug-infested den, as the president has said, and we're really characterized nationally by our rates of opioid use. And, you know, if you think about the idea that a substance use disorder is really a manifestation of how somebody is impacted by inequity or injustice in society, look at New Hampshire and the diminished social safety net and the regressive tax policies that take away services from people who need it most, so that the wealthiest people in New Hampshire can have tax breaks and live in a nice tax haven known as New Hampshire. So if we look to the left of us in Vermont, we see a fraction of the overdoses and less suicide rates, and other states with a stronger social safety net or a way to support the most vulnerable among us. We see less rates of fatal overdoses, rates of addiction, rates of suicide, etc. But really, we're seeing a lot of people dying per capita here in New Hampshire, and a lot of it is polysubstance use. Of course, fentanyl, I'm sure y'all have heard of fentanyl, other opioids. But really, opioids are really, so I'm gonna spend a few minutes on opioids and get into stimulants, but I do want to open it up for anybody that wants to be heard, question, comment, concern. Happy to hear from anybody in the group if you want to break up the sound of my monotonous voice.
Peg had a question.
Sure.
Yeah, when you were talking about the difference between New Hampshire and Vermont, it seemed to me, I've been like around for a really long time. I'm no spring chicken, and it wasn't all that long ago that New Hampshire really said, "Hey, wait a minute," or at least here in the North Country, we might actually really have a problem. Before then, it was over there. It was in Massachusetts. It was in Vermont. It was in Maine. If we didn't acknowledge we had a problem, we didn't have to deal with it, which is ridiculous, but nonetheless. But we're just getting there now. So do you think, honestly, that it is a tax revenue? Because that money has to be spent purposefully. And I'm not so sure that always happens. Or do you think it's just that we are in a younger state of learning how to do this than Vermont, perhaps, or others?
I think that,
or maybe both.
I think that where I'm going to go with that is that, you know, that harm reduction principle of nothing about us without us, and having people with lived experience being an active participant in developing policies that are impacted by them. So having the service population develop service provision. You know, because I would say on paper, New Hampshire gets out enough naloxone. We fund enough naloxone, have a great infrastructure. We're funding harm reduction, but sometimes it's about, you know, having the voices of marginalized people heard as we develop systems. You know, because I see a lot of money go to things, and it's like, that's great, but what about housing? That's great, but what about food?
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of the recovery capital stuff that we're doing shows that housing, food, all these things are having incredible impact on whether someone's able to move forward in their recovery. And we don't have that. But I don't know that taxes is going to help. Tourists and people from other directions, at least in Mount Washington Valley, kind of rule the area.
Yeah, I mean, I got sober at a time when there was no recovery centers. There was really no line to call or a safe station. And I've seen New Hampshire do a really, really, really great job of improving and continuing to improve. And I love the improvements that have happened. But sometimes it's just like, who decided that was what we're going to do? Like, why are we sending people to the hospital for help? Like, you ever go to the hospital as a drug user? You know, like, so it's just a lot of frustration. And it's not so much tax revenue, because we put a lot of money towards this stuff.
Yeah, we do.
It's just, how is it being delivered? What is the end product for the people that need it?
So how do we help that?
We have to elevate voices. People that are on this call, lived experience, drug users, we got to have their voices be heard, you know, and saying, you know, like, you're developing these programs for us, like, let's have a conversation. And open and honest conversations, but unfortunately we can't have open dialogues about this stuff with drug users because of the criminalization. So it's really, I think Zoom is going to be a great platform for the 2021 legislative session. People can be heard in the State House through Zoom
Wow.
or WebEx. So thanks
you.
for bringing that up,
Thanks.
Cool. So we're at about the halfway point. I think we're making good time. Anybody else really want to bring something up before we get into opioids and stimulants and harm reduction?
Ryan, can I just say something quickly?
Oh.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for putting this on. So I stumbled upon how New Hampshire uses waiver, and I granted, please pardon my ignorance, but there's this waiver that states can apply to with the federal government, and Maryland, I think it was Maryland, applied for the waiver 1115, and they increased access to acute care settings. So it sounds like there's some flexibility and creativity with which states can use this waiver, and it's a lot of money. And I'm pretty sure that the governor and the insurance commissioner in 2018 applied for this waiver and used it to try and enforce workforce requirements for Medicaid coverage. And it's just, I don't know if anyone else knows any more about this process or whatever, but it sounds like this could be an insurance commission public comment type of deal, and the legislative session, and basically using the waiver to create more housing for people that need it, and kind of wrapping that around healthcare. I don't know. I'd love if anybody can point me in the right direction or knows anything about this, please help me out. Anyway, thanks, Ryan.
Hey, welcome. Thank you, Whitney. And that's a perfect example of, open public hearings and testimonies that are needed to develop these initiatives to help people, because the money's there. The federal government's dropping lots of wonderful money on us, but it's we need to hear the voices of the most vulnerable. Of the people in the encampment in Manchester that are being cleared out, we should elevate those voices. Why aren't their needs being met? And what can we do to support people who are unhoused and experiencing these conditions? And so thank you, Whitney, for bringing that up, for sure. So happy to field questions as they pop into the chat. But really, the next part of this is going to be kind of like the drug education you never got in DARE. I'm a DARE graduate and a former injection drug user. I only really knew about drugs that people did them because they were losers and people who were going to prey on me and give them to me at some point, and neither of which were necessarily true, maybe a little bit. But my experience with drugs is that they served a purpose in my life. And I was in high school from 2004 to 2008 and had access to a bunch of OxyContin and all sorts of strong opioids. And I really enjoyed them a lot because I had an anxiety issue and I was suicidal. I didn't know about dependency or really addiction. I just knew that if I didn't take pills or drink, I felt like crap. And I graduated high school and I was using heroin and cocaine on a very regular basis. And I just didn't know what I didn't know. And I learned what I needed to know in rehab. And I really think that prevention needs to look at a fact-based education. The stuff that I learned in rehab at 25, I should have learned at 12. Mental health awareness, emotional intelligence, mindfulness, meditation, identifying role models, all these things I learned. But really, to understand opioids, you really got to understand that the opioid parts of the brain are important for a lot of things. Our sense of connection, pain regulation, emotional stuff. And our body produces its own opioids, also known as endorphins. But really, when we take opioids, whether that be natural, like opium alkaloids, semi-synthetics, so coming from nature but partially man-made, or fully synthetic or fully man-made, they attach to opioid receptors, they depress the central nervous system, so they slow down brain activity, they slow down breathing and blood rate. And they block pain signals, and really they release a lot of dopamine. And dopamine does a lot of things, but what I like to emphasize about dopamine is that it reinforces life-sustaining activities. It says, this feels good, do that again. This is going to prolong the species. And so when we eat food, drink water, seek shelter, have sex, care for our young, our children, we get dopamine that says do that again. But opioids or other drugs that release dopamine, like stimulants, give you more dopamine than you may ever receive naturally on your own. And it reinforces taking drugs as a life-sustaining activity. And so we see people like myself in 2014. I couldn't feed myself. I couldn't seek shelter. I couldn't connect with my family. I was living in a vehicle, but I could find $100 in cocaine and $100 in heroin every day to shoot into my arm, because at the brain level, I was associating that with a survival technique. I needed that to survive at some level. And we really kind of have figured this out: opioids, opioid dependency, the role of dopamine. And really, on opioids are depressants, so they slow down brain activity. And too much of an opioid will depress the brain stem in the back of the brain. And the brain stem tells you to do things automatically, like breathing, digesting food, growing hair and fingernails. But an opioid overdose is the brain not telling the lungs to breathe. We give them naloxone to reverse the effects of the opioid and give the brain the signal to tell the lungs to breathe. And if somebody comes back from an overdose from opioids, harm reduction is about treating them with dignity and respect, being realistic, and recognizing that people make decisions based on their circumstances. And post-overdose is not the time for an intervention because their brain has been turned off completely. And I like to emphasize rescue breathing or mouth-to-mouth resuscitation with a CPR mask or a barrier, because we're seeing a lot of overdoses that are translating to anoxic brain injuries or brain injuries that are from an overdose or lack of oxygen. And what we're seeing in people that have overdosed on opioids time and time again is that they're living with layered anoxic brain injuries, and that affects your attention, your memory, your executive functioning, all things that are crucial for substance use recovery. And so we see this population who has overdosed maybe dozens of times, maybe just once. But if you were out for 3 minutes or more, you start to experience cell death in the brain. And what I'm seeing anecdotally are people who have overdosed a bunch of times, for sometimes being out for hours at a time, and they're switching to stimulants because they're sick of overdosing, and the stimulants are doing something for them. What that is person to person, I don't know. I don't have an MRI machine, but really it's important to ask your recoveries, have you ever overdosed? What's the longest you've ever been out? Have you ever considered, and if you do suspect that, you can connect with the Brain Injury Association of New Hampshire to learn about finding a neurologist to address this. But really the big difference, one of the many big differences between opioids and stimulants is that the FDA has approved medications for opioid use disorder. We acknowledge that people have a dependency on opioids, so we give them a safe supply of buprenorphine or methadone, or we give them an antagonist or a blocker like naltrexone or the name brand Vivitrol. There's a lot of different, things we could go into here, but we kind of address this as a medical issue and give medicine. Some people are abstinent and that's best for them. There's people like me that utilize cannabis as a pathway of recovery. We need really all options on the table, but really the FDA hasn't approved any medications for stimulants. And we really kind of tell people things that are half truths or not truths at all. So that's kind of just to get our understanding of opioids. So they're a depressant, they slow down brain activity. They're addictive because of dopamine, and we have medications for them. Anybody have any questions or comments on opioids before we get into the stimulant part of this?
I have a question, Ryan. Can you just clarify, you had mentioned something immediately after an overdose to take a realistic approach, with the person after an overdose reversal. Now is not the time. I just was taking some notes. Now is not the time, and I can't really finish that sentence. I was trying to remember exactly what you said, because we respond to the hospital after an overdose reversal as peer supports. You just said something and I didn't get the last part of it.
Oh, I would say give them about an hour or more, depending on how long they were out, because the brain has been shut off from the front to the back. Naloxone turns it on 0 to 60, and they're kind of like panicky, fight or flight. And we wonder about people getting irritable the scene of an overdose because they're being asked questions they don't have the answer for. There's no memory recall. Give them at least an hour, maybe a couple hours. That's really, you know,
Okay.
I think a lot of programs go 24 hours post, but yeah, that's kind of where I was going with that. Thank you for asking that so I could clarify.
Thanks, that's helpful.
And I see Peg has a hand raised as well.
Oh, I'm talking, we also put together a 24/7 hospital response program, which we've now been operating for a little over a year. And correct is like when someone has overdosed and now we end up, for a long time, they didn't go to the hospital. They just said no thanks and stayed in the basement or wherever they were. But now that they're coming, I find that it's primarily harm reduction. And not only that, but like you said before, a lot of people are not treated all that well. We've got a lot of training to do for medical staff in those locations. But being that advocate, when I see someone in the hospital and offer that advocacy without any judgment or attaching list of brochures or rehab is in your future or any of that nonsense, which is not really nonsense, it's just not that time. But at that particular time, they're usually very thankful that there's someone there that will speak for them, to them, and be a liaison between that and the medical staff. So if that helps, Julie, and I don't know how long you've done that, but I've never, sometimes you could be asked to leave in 30 seconds. I'm done, I don't want to talk to you, blah, blah. But I would say out of all of the times that I've responded, there has only been 2 times where they walked out before I got there or said, no, I don't want to talk to anybody at all. Even if they came back later on and contacted us at the center, quite often that was the case. But it was a good thing. Does that help?
Yeah. It sounds like you have a good compassionate approach that people respond to, whereas medical folks are burnt out, you know, so thank you for bringing that up.
They also quite often don't have the resources or the training to help the individual that's in that bed.
For sure, and it's important to have folks with lived experience being there to educate, for sure, so thank you for doing what you do.
I want to do it more.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, this is where we get into the stimulant stuff. I ate up a little bit more time than I wanted to the first part of this, but really what we're seeing in New Hampshire is a raise in fatal overdoses involving meth and cocaine and cathinones or bath salts. Right now, I think 1 in 5 overdoses nationally contains cocaine. 1 in 5, I think, contains meth too, but we're seeing a pretty steady rise in overdose deaths just from meth, no other drugs. We're seeing a lot of polysubstance use, so people that use an upper to stay up and a downer to go to bed. There's a lot of the fatal overdoses in New Hampshire are multiple drugs or from polysubstance use. And so harm reduction sometimes is about having a conversation of, you know, not mixing drugs, use one at a time, go slow, you know, get high but don't die. You know, there's a lot of ways to die with the illicit drug market. But meth, you know, what is it? You'll hear it called tea or ice or speed or crystal. It's a central nervous system stimulant. And methamphetamine is kind of like what I would say the king of stimulants. It produces, some would agree with, 10 times the dopamine of cocaine. And it releases noradrenaline, dopamine, and serotonin. And that methyl branch on the methamphetamine blocks their reuptake in the brain. And so it causes a lot of neurotransmitters and stimulation. So it wakes you up, increased brain activity, increased heart rate, breathing, etc. People have used amphetamines for a long time. It was first synthesized in 1887 in Germany. And then in 1919, Japan first synthesized methamphetamine. In the 40s, they were readily available through magazines, through your doctor. There was articles saying that, you know, this will make you a better housewife. This will help you with your depression or your alcoholism. You can see this ad here on the left saying that you should get a a bottle of methadone. There was a lot of weight loss pills that were amphetamines on the market. And in 1971, there was the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, which made amphetamine and methamphetamine Schedule II, or the most restricted prescription drugs. So you can be prescribed amphetamines, Adderall, Vivitrol, to some other ones, or methamphetamine prescription is Dasoxin for different various reasons. But from the time that they were outlawed in 1971, there's been an increasing demand for black market stimulants like methamphetamine. And today around the world, amphetamine type drug use is on the rise in every region of the world. And as far as New Hampshire goes, if we look at law enforcement surveillance, we're seeing really pure, readily available, really cheap methamphetamine being available in communities that have never seen it like this. For most of New Hampshire's history around this stuff, it's been, domestically made, impure, homemade methamphetamine. But what we're seeing is largely because of the dark web, like the different encrypted markets on the internet, people are having access to this stuff like never before, never been produced at the rates it is in Mexico and Canada. And there seems to be not enough conversation about supply and demand. We focus on supply and we talk about demand reduction by arresting people, but how about understanding the demand and why people in America are so intrigued or drawn to this drug meth? It decreases appetite, helps you lose weight, makes you more productive, gives you energy and euphoria and higher focus and functioning at first. It can increase your sex drive for a period of time when you first start using it. It over time can cause more and more anxiety and disinhibition. It's really characterized by compulsive redosing. And over time, people become dehydrated. The acidic nature of the drug kind of depletes physically and mentally the body and mind. You'll see folks that are grinding their teeth or jaw clenching. They could be irritable. They could be running a fever. But really what meth does is it regulates survival and self-preservation and increases the drive for pleasure and control. So it kind of gives you this illusion of control, like everything around me or you is completely chaotic, but the brain is like, hey, this is fine. We're seeking pleasure and control, and we don't have this drive for survival. And then, so we have people that continue to use. So at first, this seems like a really positive thing. Some people report the best sex of their life or being more productive. Over time, prolonged use, these seemingly positive things start to go away, and it becomes more and more negative. And then people go into withdrawal, and largely we tell people there's no withdrawal from amphetamines and that just tough it out, you're fine. But the acute withdrawal from methamphetamine long-term lasts about 10 days, and that can be really severe suicidal ideation, hallucinations, fatigue, feeling physically like crap. And then there's that 10 to 21 days after last use where people can't sleep, they're foggy, they become aggressive, they have mood swings, still depressed. And that's really where people walk out of residential treatment. That's really that sweet spot for stimulant use disorders. But really, withdrawal from long-term methamphetamine use can go for as long as a year. And at that, 3-week to 12-month mark, you have anhedonia, or the inability to feel pleasure from certain things. So you want people go from having the best sex of their life, also known as chemsex, to being, having a lack of libido, lack of, sexual dysfunction, their depression, the suicidal stuff can still be there. And what I see a lot of times, what other people report is this persecution complex. It's like people are after them. There's some delusions and sometimes the long-term, fear of people being after them. And we have a very prescriptive and punitive and regimented treatment system that kind of is a bit of a cookie cutter approach for the most part that really caters to alcohol and opioids. And so people are really re-traumatized by settings like hospitals that were brought up, as well as treatment settings. And we really need to explain to people that if you've been using amphetamines for a long time, you might have a year of withdrawal, and really there's no FDA approved medications for this, but there are whole health approaches of diet, exercise, peer support, all the things that give us dopamine naturally. because really continued use of meth or cocaine or bath salts, it depletes the dopamine receptors and other neurotransmitter receptors, and the brain stops producing them on their own. And so things that once gave folks pleasure are no longer pleasurable. And so it's about really looking at, you know, diet and nutrition as harm reduction, drinking more water, getting more sunshine, having a sense of connection and well-being, because we get a bunch of dopamine when we're connecting to people on a meaningful level. But look at our society with physical distancing. This is really hard, and I'm, you know, it's difficult stuff to work with. And you know, meth gives you, depending how you look at it, about 10 times the dopamine of cocaine. But cocaine use is on the rise too. And with cocaine right now, you know, people are dying again from solely cocaine overdoses. Cocaine right now, like meth, is very pure because cocaine comes in through the Mexico-US border. And there's a lot of focus on the concentration camps at the border where they're forcing sterilizations on people and focusing on migrants seeking asylum. The drugs are flying right through the border in record numbers. There's never been more cocaine in the country than there is right now. And people are using it, supply and demand. And so cocaine is also a stimulant. It is an extract from the coca plant, and people in the Andean regions of South America have used it for thousands of years. They chew the leaves. Occasionally you'll see a tea being made, but cocaine of these plants. In the 1850s and into the 1900s, it was considered a wonder drug in medicine. And up until 1929, there was cocaine hydrochloride in Coca-Cola, hence the name. And in 1914, it was made illegal to use powdered cocaine in some very racialized drug policies that we see today. And it is a Schedule II drug that is still used sometimes as an anesthetic in medicine. And cocaine does not facilitate the release of neurotransmitters, but it blocks the reuptake of dopamine, noradrenaline, and serotonin, and increases their concentration in the brain. Cocaine is shorter acting, so it doesn't last as long, and it is you know, comes on real quick. Same increased heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature. Some people say they get confidence. People will smoke cocaine in the form of crack, where they mix cocaine hydrochloride with baking soda, and they smoke it, and it comes on quicker, is a stronger effect, and come down is even worse, even harder. And when injected, the effects are immediate, and the come down is really worse when you smoke it or inject it. All cocaine on the market has adulterants, including fentanyl or other really yucky things like levamisole. With excessive or prolonged use, the drug can start to cause itching or the feeling of bugs on your skin, increase heart rate, hallucinations, paranoid delusions. This can damage the heart or blood vessels, causing stroke, aneurysms, or heart attacks. It has a high potential for addiction, use despite negative consequences. The physical and mental withdrawal symptoms of cocaine are real unpleasant. The come down is really, can cause people to redose compulsively, and that can sometimes lead to overdose because people don't know what's in their bag. And so there's a lot of damage that comes with long-term use. Snorting can damage the nose and the throat. People have gotten nose and throat cancer from continuing to snort cocaine. Injecting can damage the veins, cause infection, and spread disease. And the continued use of any stimulant drug can cause sleep deprivation, insomnia. Again, combining drugs, higher risk of fatal overdoses, and sharing snorting devices like straws or bills can spread Hep C and other diseases. So the same reason we tell people not to share syringes, people should also not share their snorting utensils. That's cocaine. In some areas of the state, including where I am in Claremont, we see a lot of these drugs known as bath salts or synthetic cathinones. Cathinones are derived from the khat plant, and 20 million people use khat every day worldwide. And what bath salts are essentially really short-acting, fast-acting stimulants or uppers. Some of them make you euphoric, some of them make you hallucinate and paranoid, some of them are more like methamphetamine, but they're even shorter acting than cocaine. And oftentimes people are sold bath salts or cathinones as drugs of deception. So people are sold one thing, this is MDMA, it's really MDPV, this is cocaine, it's really methadone. And there are hundreds of compounds in this family and new compounds today to evade criminalization and prohibition of substances. Out here in Claremont, this is the primary drug that I see in kind of, I'll say lower income people for sure, because again, the internet has made these drugs available to people. Similar effects to cocaine and meth, but shorter acting. And the media has reported a lot of different things from zombie attacks to, but there's been a lot of heart attacks, kidney failure, liver failure. People commit, attempt and complete suicide quite a bit with these drugs. Not a lot is known about what they're doing beyond the release of dopamine and noradrenaline. People become dehydrated, and I see a lot of people with skin or muscle issues and depression from dopamine depletion. So long-term depletion of dopamine and serotonin, depression is a big part of this. And so, you know, talking to folks about, you know, have you ever considered therapy or psychiatry, you know, staying in your lane, of course, but really, with the bath salts, you see more common instances of people that are paranoid, delusional, with hallucinations, and a lot of other really negative stuff. Cathinones have a higher potential for addiction and are characterized again by that redosing. There's a lot of impurities or cut in the cathinones that are sweated through the skin, and they kind of irritate and eat at the skin, and people report visions of having bugs or worms in their skin, and they pick at their skin. And I have a few folks who use the SSP that I operate, and they have to wrap their arms in bandages so they don't pick at themselves compulsively. They're potent, fast acting, and overdose is common. And to get into this part here, isn't like an opioid overdose where you're kind of out and unresponsive. Overdosing on stimulants, you could be agitated, delusional, overheating. You could have uncontrolled motor movement because dopamine is connected to motor function. So if you have way too much dopamine in your synaptic gap, you're gonna have uncontrolled movement, paranoia, delusion, hallucinations, and physically you could see stroke, organ failure, heart attack, and death. And naloxone or Narcan will not reverse a stimulant overdose. Again, this could look like a lot of different things. I think there's a population in like Manchester that their standard is a stimulant overdose. They're injecting or smoking way too much, and they're overdosing and depleting their brain and their body of a lot of crucial nutrients and neurotransmitters. But this could be dangerous. People could be hallucinating, they could be aggressive, they could be in psychosis. But really working with people in these states of mind, it's, you know, think about your posture and how you're looking at somebody, your tone of voice, your, you know, asking kind of really simple questions and making sure that they feel safe. And they're overheating, and they could have a seizure, stroke, heart attack, organ problems, and they should be seen by medical professionals, but the person's dehydrated. So see if they want water. Remove stimulus from the environment, make sure they feel safe. And if they don't want water, see if they want a cool wet cloth for the back of their head or neck or under their armpits or knees. You want to cool them down and make sure they feel safe.
Mary, Jill, can you like figure out why it did that? And I can't get.
Oh,
So there we are. So stimulant overdose. Anybody have any questions or comments about stimulant overdose? Anything I said I can clarify for you? I'm kind of throwing info at you at this point.
Can I say something? I like that you said, Ryan, the emphasis on making sure they feel safe. I think that's important.
For sure. And if they run, don't try to hold them down. They don't have that executive functioning thing going. They can't discern, I shouldn't punch you right now. But really it's heavy stuff to work with for sure, but dignity and respect and compassion and making sure they feel safe. And if they're willing to talk to you, how can we ensure that you're safe? How can we ensure that you're protecting yourself and others? So thank you for sharing that. And we see if anybody has another question or comment, you can type into the chat. I have 17 minutes to throw a bunch more info at you. So we see stimulants, in particular meth, affecting different populations at higher rates. So the LGBTQ positive community uses stimulants at higher rates than heterosexual men and women. You know, there's a lot of studies that go into this, but really you can see here on this study from 2015 to 2017, you saw 3 times the amount of gay men using compared to heterosexual. And this is really common. Like when I was using in 2014 and prior, this was synonymous with some gay clubs in Manchester and other communities of gay and lesbian folks that I knew. And this was really really the first places I actually got real crystal meth was kind of from these populations of people. And so this is not irrelevant, but really what I want to emphasize is that meth really increases drive for sex and will oftentimes make people do things they wouldn't normally, including homosexual different types of things. And so really important to remember that men who have sex with men are not necessarily homosexual. You can have a conversation about risk reduction and harm reduction, and for men who have sex with men who are at higher risk for a number of things, without assuming that they're gay, because that's going to be really alienating or isolating for folks. So to really just remember that, you know, however people identify, that's fine, but really important to recognize that certain communities are impacted by stimulant use more. And really it's about creating a culture that addresses rape culture and emphasizes consent and accurate evidence-based educational materials, and creating spaces for survivors to be heard, and criminalizing sex work and sex workers and victims of sex crimes. Because remember, this creates a high propensity for sex and sexual violence. There's a huge issue in Boston right now with men who have sex with men in the meth community, and essentially borderline consensual, non-consensual rapes, and what's going on with disease rates, STIs, and chemsex. These are really hard conversations to have, but when you really get into it, people are using to begin with. And so this might be that strengths-based approach of what's right about this? What do you enjoy about it? I see that you've lost everything to your addiction, but why do you keep doing it? And oftentimes you'll find the connection to sex. And make condoms cool again. Give out condoms in your recovery center. Make sure people have condoms, because condoms are prevention, condoms are harm reduction. And remember to emphasize consent in all of our life. Informed, explicit, affirmative decision made freely and actively by all parties to engage in mutually acceptable and desired activity. Do you consent to these services? Not just about sex. This slide is about sex, but consent within provision of services. Do you consent to what we're doing here? And if not, what can we do? And hearing people and hearing when there is consent or lack thereof. But sometimes the best thing we can do for people is to understand like where they're at with their understanding of consent, because we lack that conversation in our society. And we'll see higher rates of stimulant use by race. Interestingly, Native American populations have a higher rate based on SAMHSA's reporting, and this isn't perfect. I could poke holes in this, but this is just a section of people that SAMHSA substantiated the data. We'll see, this is kind of irrelevant. It is, but it isn't. But really, sometimes people are using to self-medicate, and that includes feelings of isolation because of racism or sexism or other types of discrimination. So if people want to talk about the race topic as it relates to their drug use, let it happen. We have these really knee-jerk reactions that we can't talk about that here. That's not relevant. We're talking about you, but what we see in marginalized populations is that the self-medicating might be about race or gender or sexual discrimination. So it's important to be aware that addiction treatment systems really cater to people like me, straight white males. There's disparities in admissions to treatment, and we really need to look at that through a different lens and see why the most vulnerable people in New Hampshire can't seem to get the services they need. And that kind of brings me to the end of this, which is talking about harm reduction as a way to prevent disease. So people who use stimulants and have a higher rate of dangerous or risky sex, they have higher rates for HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. Injection drug use and other types of drug use are related to a rise in Hep C stats. And the CDC suggests every American should be tested at least once for Hep C, because it's now estimated that 1% of all adults in the United States have Hep C, and most don't know it. And HIV is, Hep C is now curable, true, too. So if folks want to learn about Hep C treatment and being cured, certainly shoot me an email. And all these slides will be available to you after the presentation, as long with some other resources. And HIV is to a point now with medications that it can be undetectable and untransmittable. So the sooner someone starts HIV meds, the better. So everybody should know their status and know where to get tested. You know, it's really important to be tested, especially folks that are coming from drug use or sex work or other areas of life. Know your status and know that Hep C can be cured, and HIV is really, really treatable and nearly being able to be cured. PrEP is an important conversation to have, or pre-exposure prophylaxis, the HIV prevention drug. People can take 1 pill a day and have a less likelihood of contracting HIV from a partner. And we really need to look at those vulnerable populations, men who have sex with men, et cetera. Everything's talked about PrEP, not only for sex, but also injection drug use. So PrEP is a whole other presentation. Millions of Americans have Hep C and many don't know it, so know your status and get treated. Harm reduction tips and tricks for uppers. I always encourage folks to sleep when you can, eat food, drink water, set personal limits, avoid mixing substances, go slow. If you can, use a fentanyl test strip or reagent test kit to see what's in your bag. Magnesium, the 1-a-day supplement, can reduce jaw clenching and muscle pain. People should not IM or skin pop their stimulants because they're really acidic and can cause really gross abscesses. Use a new cotton filter every time and know the risks, and know that there's help available. Specifically for injecting, never share any of your supplies at the Claremont Exchange and other H2RC syringe services programs. We give out not only sterile syringes, but sterile cottons, cookers, tourniquets, and water, because they can all be a vector for disease. Use a new needle every time, new cotton every time. We try to give out hand sanitizer and make sure people are washing their hands while they prepare their injection. Use an alcohol pad before you inject, but not after, to make sure your bacteria doesn't get into your bloodstream, because we see a lot of endocarditis or bacterial infections in the blood that are preventable with new syringes and alcohol pads. So having these conversations can be difficult, and use a new water every time. Use heat underneath your cooker to kill bacteria, and drink enough water and use tourniquets to have better access to your veins. These are just kind of things that I'll say to folks at the syringe services program. We give out plenty of fentanyl test strips because any pill or powder could contain fentanyl. Readily available. If you have questions, you can email me or put into the chat. Contingency management is a little bit clinical, but it really is about positive reinforcement. When you see contingency management, you see usually gift cards as a form of positive reinforcement that says you had a negative urine screen, or you attended a 1-hour session, or you completed this workbook. And really everything we know about use disorders aligns with contingency management and not so much about negative reinforcement. Really a lot of evidence to support this, and really looking at Medicaid maybe even paying for this, because the treatment retention for stimulant use disorders is so much greater if you have a small monetary reward, because that reward system, that dopamine, they know that if they go to this 1-hour session with their peer support, they're going to get a $20 gas card afterwards. They're much more likely to come and continue because they're getting dopamine in a natural way that reinforces behavior, and it helps because people are hurting right now. And the safe supply conversation is a tricky one to have because this gets into clinical a bit, but the idea is that anybody who can prescribe Schedule II can prescribe stimulants off-label as a replacement therapy or an agonist therapy for stimulant dependency. We know folks are dependent on stimulants and we tell them to stop, But what about folks who can't stop? And what we see is, I'll send this out afterwards, there's a lot of support that goes to similar outcomes for medication-assisted treatment using stimulants that we see with Suboxone. So if there's any clinicians on the phone looking to safe supply replacement therapies for stimulants, because the folks I know who are in their 40s or 50s who were using stimulants in the 80s and 90s, they get a script to Adderall or Vyvanse or something, you know, and it really aligns with what we know about chemical dependency and use disorders. And tonight at 7 and then every Monday online, New Hampshire has a Harm Reduction Works meeting. It's a peer support group that focuses on harm reduction strategies and gives folks an arena to be heard. Tonight at 7, it's one of the co-founders, Jess Tilley, will be speaking about her experience as a drug user working in harm reduction. The website is harmreduction.works. Really great stuff, really great way to learn more about harm reduction, meet other harm reductionists in New Hampshire. Really just solid group. More info on that if you'd like it. I have about 5, and I'd love to open it up. These slides will be available to you. I've kind of really gotten most of it in. You know, practice radical compassion, be a good listener, be willing to admit when you're wrong or don't know, honor people's dignity and respect, and practice self-care. You know, like, don't transfer your stuff on other people. You know, how do you handle grief? What is your grief process? What does burnout look like for you, and how do you address it? And what is vicarious trauma, and how do you keep from bringing that home with you? Or for those of us like me who work at home, what the hell do you do with that? So think about it and talk about it, and let's continue these conversations, because they're not easy conversations to have. And this is really just kind of the feet in the water type approach. And so I would love if somebody would read off this last slide here, and then we could round out the last 5 minutes or so with conversation. And then Alyssa or somebody can break it down at 12:30. So any volunteers to read this guy here before we wrap up?
I'll read. Daryl, harm reduction includes all paths to recovery as defined by each person in their own way. This includes moderation, continued use with less risk of overdose, death and illnesses like HIV and hepatitis, as well as abstinence from most substances. Harm reduction even includes continued use with no goal to change behavior. No path is better or worse than another. The point is, we talk about drugs, including alcohol, harm, and how to reduce harm without confrontation in ways that are respectful, kind, compassionate, and free of moral judgment. Sometimes these conversations are incredibly difficult. What harm reduction teaches us is to talk with others without judgment, to listen deeply to stories people share.
Thank you, Daryl. And it really emphasizes, you know, my recovery journey was utilizing the healing power of storytelling that our ancestors and indigenous cultures have used for millennia. The healing power of storytelling and connecting and open and honest conversations without fear of judgment or punishment. And that's really what you'll find in the harm reduction community and HRW meetings. This is part of the Harm Reduction Works script. So at every meeting, we'll hear this and a lot of other great stuff that Albie and Jess put together. We got a few minutes. Happy to hear from folks until we get to go. So thank y'all for listening, and I'd encourage y'all to reach out. And you will have this slide deck, and you can use it however you want.
I did wonder, like, because there's people that come in our center all the time. Like, I wish there was a way that we could, you know, I kind of asked them if they had any opioid history or if they've ever had any issues, but like accessing almost equal funding streams for people that use alcohol and or methamphetamine or any type of uppers. Like, is there a way that we could find a funding stream rather than have them, you know, I have to ask them questions like, have you ever had any struggles with opioids? Or, you know, I feel like, you know, we shouldn't discriminate on drug of choice, for lack of better words.
Daryl, I can speak to that as far as working in the doorway as well, as you know. Yeah, if they're not an opiate user, but it is, I know that there's work being done. I just don't know what the progress is. If anyone else can speak to that, but yeah, that's a barrier. Stimulant use.
And that's definitely an issue that was brought up by impacted populations. And the new round of SOAR funding is going to include more ability to use funds for stimulants and other drugs. And that's a prime example of, you know, we're out here doing this work and we have barriers because people haven't used opioids in a while. Those voices were heard, and the new round of funding will include more for people who use stimulants. So perfect example, Daryl, and it's also a good example of how things are getting better. So thank you. Anyone else want to be heard? Now's your time. I mean, happy to connect offline too.
Ryan, I'll just throw it out there, and I don't know if it's appropriate for anyone to answer if they have any experience based on knowing what treatment centers that we access typically in this area locally that accepts Medicaid. I've never really heard that one specifically is better treating for stimulant use. I didn't know if anyone had any suggestions or had any experience with that.
I don't know.
No.
I guess I'll just say anecdotally that there's more of a population with primarily stimulant use disorder in residential treatment. So at one point it was like, you know, 20 opioid people to one stimulant user. Now the stimulant group is growing, so people don't feel as isolated in treatment. But as far as modalities or who does better, I don't really know. But
Yeah,
we're definitely seeing a lot more of it in treatment. So hopefully we can adapt.
Thank you.
I'm probably going to hand it over to Alyssa or Polly or Lena to close us out. I've had you for 90 minutes. I really appreciate your time, and I'm happy to stay on or be heard. You can connect with me via email or phone. But thank y'all. I really appreciate you being here. So hand it back over to Harbor Care folks. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ryan. Thank you for your time. It's an excellent presentation. A lot of gratitude in the chat for you too. I want to thank everyone for attending. I hope this was helpful and provided you with information that can help you with all your participants. We're going to close it out. The recording and all the slides and materials will be emailed to those of you who have registered for your reference. So thank you again for attending. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.